Everybody, thank you so much for being with us tonight. My name is Aditya Rao. I am a member of the board of the New Brunswick Media Co-op, and I'm speaking to you from the stolen lands of the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Pescataway peoples in what is now known as Fredericton, New Brunswick. I've had the honor and privilege to live and thrive on the lands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples before this, when I lived in Ottawa, and before that on Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, which often still feels like home, which is on the lands of the Plains and Wood Cree, the Nakota, the Saulteaux, and Dene people. We're days away from our country's first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And although the federal government has proclaimed this National Day for somber reflection, our provincial government here in New Brunswick has refused so far to do the same. So all of us today on this call who are not Indigenous to these lands have a significant role to play to further the goals of reconciliation. And as we continue on our journeys, I ask you all to take time in the coming days to send a note to the Premier asking him to honor the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to recognize September 30th and to make a plan to ensure that no New Brunswicker will ever be able to claim ignorance of the horrors our country has committed through the dispossession and colonization of Indigenous lands. I am very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Arshy Mann to you today. Arshy is a prolific journalist and podcaster who has covered a variety of issues. He's the host and producer of Canadaland Commons, a series from Canadaland, which is an online independent news site and podcast network focused on Canadian media, news, current affairs, and politics. We're quite excited to have Arshy with us. This is our second collaboration with Canadaland since 2015, when Canadaland was live in Fredericton for a discussion on the Irvings and their control over media and forestry in this province in collaboration with the New Brunswick Media Co-op. You can find an article about that event on our website at nbmediacoop.org by searching for Canadaland in the search bar. The article from 2015 is titled Canadaland Live in Fredericton, Biting the Hand that Feeds Us in Irving Land. Arshy's work on Canadaland Commons has touched on money laundering, white-collar crime, Canada's family dynasties, including the Irvings here in New Brunswick, and most recently what he calls Canada's obsession with real estate. The series on real estate canvasses a broad swath of issues that we face as a country when it comes to Canada's obsession with real estate. From how dispossession of Indigenous lands led to the foundation of real estate gambling across the country, to forced evictions of Black people in Halifax's Africville, to an irreverent critique of the Toronto Community Housing Corporation, who Arshy refers to as Canada's biggest slumlord. As we grapple with the housing crisis here in New Brunswick, amidst out-of-control rent increases, a lack of eviction protections for tenants, and a reckless disregard on the part of our government for the human right to adequate housing, we're very pleased that Arshy has agreed to give this year's keynote for the NB Media Co-op's AGM on Canada's addiction to real estate. After his brief remarks, there will be a Q&A moderated by Matthew Hayes, who many of you already know. He is a member of the New Brunswick Coalition for Tenants Rights and a Canada Research Chair at St. Thomas University, currently researching, among other things, the financialization of housing. With that, Arshy, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Aditya, and I'm really excited to be here and so glad that you guys asked me to participate. One thing that I always find kind of interesting when we're talking about real estate or about housing is everyone has a story. I mean, this is one of the most central things to all of us, is to find some shelter and be able to live out our lives. So I figured I could just kind of initially run through just a little bit of kind of what that's looked like for me. So I grew up around the suburbs of Vancouver and lived in Vancouver itself for about 6 or 7 years in student housing, and also in, the terrible basement apartments that tend to proliferate in the city. And I've been in Toronto now for about 10 years. And other than that, other than a 6-month stint in Berlin, those are the two cities that I've lived in. And as you might imagine, for the last many years, they have been unpleasant places in which to try to house yourself. And so during that time, I probably lived in about 20 different kinds of living arrangements. I've had something like 30 or 40 different roommates. I've been evicted a number of times, both through rent eviction or through kind of other means as well. I faced, all of the kind of rent increases that everyone has, although I've been lucky because unlike New Brunswick, both British Columbia and Ontario have some form of rent control. So that hasn't been too bad. But even just in the last 5 years in Toronto, I've been evicted twice. The first time was your kind of typical story in which I lived in a place with a bunch of other roommates, and the building was purchased. The building was sold, and then the new owners claimed that they wanted to live in it themselves. And so we all had to leave. Of course, we knew that was a lie from the beginning. And we saw the construction crews there within days, renovating the inside and turning what was I think seven or eight different rooms into maybe 4. So literally just watching the housing stock kind of diminish before our eyes. And, as a kind of journalist, I was always looking for ways in which I could possibly report them to the landlord tenant board or find some kind of way to get, to bring this to the attention of the relevant authorities. But they were quite clever, and they waited 11 months exactly before they started to rent it out to other people. And when I looked at the listing, it was more than 2.5 times what we were paying for fewer rooms. So that was an unpleasant time for sure. After that, I lived for 3 years with more roommates. And in the middle of the pandemic in September, I was once again evicted, this time by them because they wanted the space for themselves. And I was quite annoyed because it was the middle of a pandemic. So I had to go again, find more housing. I lived again with 3 more people for most of the last year, up until about 2 months ago, where I finally was able to find something that I can sort of afford by myself. So this is the first, I'm 33 now, and this is the first time where I've had the ability to live by myself in either of these very large cities. When it comes to, kind of purchasing property, that's never going to be an option, I think. And I think many of us are obviously kind of in that boat, and I've come to peace with that, although I get very annoyed by our general conversation about real estate because so much of it is focused just on that, middle class to upper middle class kind of couples' ability to purchase like a single detached home somewhere around a big city, when obviously we know that there's so much more to that. To the issue of housing, and so little focus, often falls on whether social housing or when it comes to the concerns of renters or anything like that. So, that was one of the reasons I wanted to do this season on kind of real estate. We focus very little, actually, I think, to the surprise and chagrin of some of our listeners on that issue of just like, why can't I go buy a home right now? And like, although that is, I think, a very important and relevant issue, but we wanted to highlight some of the kind of other aspects around housing. So yeah, that is, I think, kind of about my little kind of like housing rant there about, and now you know a little bit more about me. And yeah, I mean, maybe from here, it'd be a great time to bring Matthew in, and we can just start kind of a little bit of a back and forth.
Thanks, Arshy. Matthew, are you around? Are you prepared? I don't see. Oh, there you are. All right.
So Arshy, we've followed some of your work on Canadaland. Can you tell us a little bit about how you started reporting on real estate? I mean, you've told us a little bit about your own experience with it, but how did this emerge as a subject, particularly for your professional work?
One of my biggest interests has always been around white collar crime. I think we in Canada is basically a haven for white collar crime around the world. It is well known that we have both incredibly weak laws around it, incredibly weak enforcement. It's a place where dirty money ends up from across the world, but all forms of kind of white collar crime proliferate here. And so much of that is tied into real estate. Real estate, especially in the Western world, is the destination for illicit kind of profits and criminal funds from every corner of the globe. I mean, this has been think one of the kind of underreported but most significant stories of like the world in the last, since basically the 1970s, is there's been an explosion in wealth, especially from developing countries, but that wealth is concentrated within a basically kind of criminal oligarch class. But those folks don't want to have their money in the countries in which they live because it's a danger of being taxed or being seized. And also they have a kind of, like love of all things kind of luxury and Western. And so basically Western countries and these developing, these oligarchs in developing countries, as well as oligarchs in Western countries as well, I should add, came to a lovely little compromise, which was, please bring all of that dirty money over here and you can put it into real estate, and everyone will profit. And entire industries have kind of developed around this. We've seen through things like the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, whether we're talking about accountants, wealth managers, lawyers in a variety of offshore havens, which is usually the first destination for a lot of this money. But the end destination is always, well, for a long time, it was large urban centers in the kind of so-called West. I mean, now it's going even into smaller urban centers and into other forms of land. So that is kind of where my initial interest in real estate kind of stemmed from. But there's one of the great things about being able to work on the show that I do is we get to kind of really dig deep into history, Canadian history in particular, and actually kind of take it seriously and treat it as a subject worth studying, which I think sometimes we kind of forget in this country that we need to do that. And so many of the kind of big questions that this country and this land is kind of pivoted on have been issues around land, obviously, right? I mean, when we think about kind of European settlement and colonization, right, the denial of Indigenous title to their own lands was, the central mechanism of dispossession, right? That was the primary goal, was to acquire the land out from under the first peoples who were actually living here. And you see, those patterns repeated over and over as kind of industry moves in. So whether you have it when it comes to obviously the railroad and then the communities that develop around the railroad in the West, those were, those were questions of real estate. And those were where we got our first real estate booms, right? So when we think about a city like Vancouver in particular, right, Vancouver's only good nickname is Terminal City. It sounds kind of cool, and it's called that because it was the terminus of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Vancouver really grew up because of a corrupt real estate deal that centered around, first, the dispossession of the land from the Coast Salish peoples who lived there, and then secondly, kind of all of this conniving stuff around trying to up the property prices for when the railroad was going to arrive. I mean, if you look at what happened in Vancouver back in, what was it, I think the 1880s, although I may have the decade wrong there, the terminus of the railroad was not supposed to be in Vancouver. It was supposed to be in Port Moody, a nearby city. But then the politicians, this Canadian Pacific Railway officials and their friends started purchasing property in a settlement called Granville, which is now today Vancouver. And they did that so that they could buy the land incredibly cheaply and then decide to move the terminus there, and then they make a bunch of money. And so you can see already there the questions of kind of dispossession of Indigenous people, as well as our love for real estate and the connections to politics are established right in the bones of this country at the beginning. So yeah, that's a long-winded answer of some of the reasons why I'm interested in this, but yeah.
You talk about the dispossession in Vancouver of Indigenous peoples, but they're actually not the only people that are dispossessed through shady real estate. Can you tell us a little bit about World War II and how that also changes with the dispossession of the Japanese Canadian population there?
Yeah, I mean, this was a fascinating thing that I got to learn through this. I think we all are familiar with the internment of Japanese Canadians, in which, people are basically kidnapped and taken, east of the Rocky Mountains, and for years, entire families. And, the logic of that obviously was, well, we can't trust these people who might have loyalties to Japan, a country we are currently at war with. There may be a land invasion coming, and we'll have this fifth column there. And, in its own twisted way, you can kind of understand that logic, right? It's evil, but like there is some apparent justification. What I didn't know was that shortly after these Japanese Canadians were basically kidnapped and interned, the government decided to liquidate all of their holdings and basically keep the money for themselves. So not only was this kind of a mass kidnapping, it then became, one of the biggest robberies in Canadian history. Japanese Canadians were dispersed throughout Western BC. Many people lived on Vancouver Island. Many people lived in Vancouver itself, and then into the Fraser Valley. And, one good example of this would be there's a neighborhood around Gastown. I can't remember exactly the specific location, but it was basically, Japantown. And this is now some of the most valuable land in Vancouver. And when it was basically all of it was taken out from under them. And one thing that was used as justification was that these properties are not valuable because Japanese Canadians basically are unable to keep them up because they're an inferior race and they live differently than the rest of us, and so these are slums. And you see that logic again and again throughout Canadian history as well. The justification of taking, basically stealing land or evicting people because they live in slum-like conditions. But most of the time, it's just an excuse to get the land or to kick out people who are seen as racially inferior in some way. So, some of the land that was taken from Japanese Canadians, this was generational wealth, on an absolutely massive scale. The amounts at which that land is valued at today is in the billions easily. There was a good study done. I didn't get into this in the podcast because we were focusing on Vancouver. There's a good study done about some of the land on, I believe it's one of the Gulf Islands that was owned by a large, Japanese Canadian landholder. That land was then taken from him when he was interned, and it was split off into a bunch of kind of white settlers were able to acquire that for dirt cheap. And the amount of money that they were able to get just from selling off tiny parcels of the already divided land in the 1970s was in the tens of millions easily. And that's what led to, so there's people in these families now still on the West Coast who benefited directly to the tunes of tens, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars by this theft. Yeah, it's one of the most horrific aspects of Japanese internment in a lot of ways, because there is no justification. It was plain theft. And very little was done to actually redress it. There were commissions, there was some form of compensation, but not to the level that the land actually became worth if the people who owned it had held on to it.
Yeah, I think I can't remember exactly when it was. Was it in the late 80s or early 90s that there was a settlement, or was it later than that? I mean, obviously this is land too that has continued to be the heart of the city of Vancouver. So,
and not just Vancouver, right? It was Abbots, these massive berry farms in Abbotsford, right? Or these areas with big forestry industry kind of exists now, right? It had a lot of use, a lot of value, and yeah. It's kind of amazing, how much wealth was stolen out from under them. Yeah, I do think you're right. I think it was in the 1980s was this settlement, but it was not to the level that it should have been.
And you know, one of the options or the alternatives, I suppose, that has existed in Canada, especially in the post-war period, to kind of private markets for land and especially for real estate, have been social housing. And you've also done work on social housing in Canada, particularly the Toronto Community Housing Corporation. And there are problems with the Toronto Community Housing Corporation. Can you tell us a little bit about? Maybe you could start and tell us what the dream or the intention was of the TCHC, or what its possibilities were, and then you know, what happened.
Yeah, I mean, so the Toronto Community Housing Corporation is, as far as I can tell, the second largest landlord in North America after the New York Public Housing Corporation. I'm not totally, maybe I should say Canada and the United States, because I'm not totally familiar with, say, what's happening in Mexico. There's a bigger landlord there, but you know, one out of every, I think it's something like 8% of Toronto residents live in the TCHC. So it is this absolutely massive, very important institution in this city. And when it was kind of coming about, you know, it goes through a lot of different phases. But initially, I think maybe the best place to start is the creation of Regent Park. This was really the first kind of social housing built in Canada, at least in the form that we think of it. And, you know, there were good intentions there. And they wanted to make something that in which, you know, poor returning veterans could live in, newer immigrants, people who had fallen down on their luck. You know, it was part of a kind of like of a responsibility ethic to the citizens of the city, or the residents of the city. But, you know, right off of the bat, there were kind of massive problems in how it was constructed. And I mean, this is a story we've seen in a lot of different, you know, social housing that was built in the post-war period throughout North America. You know, something like, you know, the story like Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis kind of comes to mind. Obviously, there's a lot to that. But, you know, with Regent Park, a lot of the kind of built form of it was made in a way to kind of segregate the residents there from the rest of the city. So it doesn't flow into much of the rest of Toronto. If you go to Regent Park itself, it has changed significantly now over the years because there's been a lot of redevelopment, but you can still see the kind of narrow like alleys. There aren't roads that go in itself. And it used to be that all of the services there, because it was kind of just this little like fiefdom, were run by like the housing corporations and by the public housing corporation. What I mean by all the services, I mean the street lights, right? I mean the snow plowing, all of the kind of basic things that you expect out of a city. Well, this was like almost a little city within a city. But at the end of the day, it did provide housing for a lot of people. And so you had a number of these kinds of housing projects built throughout Toronto, you know, both in downtown as well as in the kind of outlying neighborhoods. You know, this was pre-amalgamation, so many of them, there were different kind of levels that were in charge of it and funding it, but most of it was provincial, and that was a kind of important fact. There was federal money there, cities kind of helped manage a handful of things, but this was a provincial effort, and similar housing corporations, similar housing projects were built throughout Ontario, not just in Toronto. And that is still during that period between, in the, you know, few decades after World War II, is the period where we get still most of the buildings from, right? Like that's when the building kind of happened, because there was money from both the province and from the federal government. But at the same time, you know, people weren't treated like normal tenants, right? People were had kind of, you know, second-class access to repairs, to, you know, basic services. Safety was often an issue, both safety from you know, sometimes other residents, sometimes from you know, criminal elements that may kind of take up space there. Also safety from the police, who would obviously, you know, come in and do what they will with people who live in social housing, because, you know, they have less kind of political capital and ability to kind of fight back against that. It was very interesting because I talked to John Sewell, who was the former mayor of Toronto, maybe the last good mayor we had. He was mayor in like between 1978 and 81, I think it was. And after he was mayor, a few years after that, he was asked to be the chair of the Metro Toronto Community Housing Association. This was what ran most of the social housing at the time. And what he described to me was just this attitude of almost like we can't do anything from like top managers, just a kind of complacency around the conditions that people lived in, that a week or 2 weeks was fine to not repair someone's broken toilet that's leaking everywhere and is going to cause structural damage to the building if you let it go on for long enough. He described an attitude from kind of politicians that this is not a top priority issue, just to allow people to have basic like dignity in the place that they live. And from that time period, the problems continued to get worse because first in the 1970s, first starting in the 1980s, but especially in the 1990s, the federal government got out of housing. We kind of know that story with the Chrétien and Martin budgets. They basically said, we wash our hands of this, we're done. We'll leave it to the provinces. And then, of course, in Ontario, the province also decided to get out of housing and downloaded all of the responsibility onto cities. Now, cities do not have the revenue tools necessary in order to like get enough like taxation to actually put into this, nor do they necessarily oftentimes have the kind of expertise. And so what you saw, especially in the 2000s, is a real deterioration in the housing stock in Toronto community housing, and just people living in some of the most appalling conditions. Probably my favorite reporter, if I have a hero, it's Joe Fiorito, who I was lucky enough to talk to for that episode. He's a former Toronto Star reporter who, his shtick was basically like talking to normal people about their problems and like, listening and putting it in the paper. And the stories that probably got the most recognition from him had oftentimes to do with Toronto community housing. Like the bed bug problem is so unbelievably horrific. He talks about just, seeing people with bugs crawling up and down their arms because they have bed bug anemia and they can't do anything really about it anymore. They're so sapped of energy. There were cases in which people died in Toronto community housing, their bodies were not found for 7 months. I mean, this is a community housing project, right? Like there's supposed to be people there looking out for you. You have neighbors and everything, but that's not how it was functioning. Probably the most heartbreaking story is the story of a man named Al Gosling. Al was a pensioner who'd lived in Toronto community housing for much of his life. He was a pretty simple guy. He liked to go to the store every day, read the paper, have a coffee, come back home. But he was kind of a little bit of a jerk, right? Like he was a little bit crusty. He didn't like being told what to do. And, there were notices that kept coming in about how he needed to register some new thing and, just kind of change the way that, his payments were made. His rent hadn't even increased. He was on a pension, so he makes the same amount of money every time. The rent's always the same. Because of basically the bureaucratic error, they decide to evict him. This is like an 85-year-old man. And some of the most heartbreaking stuff comes like he doesn't know what to do. So for the first week, he sleeps in the stairwell of the building. And from there, they kick him out. He ends up in a homeless shelter. And at the same time that, his situation is getting a lot of people angry in the city because the Star is writing about it, he gets sick. He contracts an illness from the shelter he's staying in and dies. And those kinds of stories are so common. We saw people being evicted during the pandemic from Toronto community housing as well, and from other community housing across Canada. So I don't know. That's my rant of Toronto community housing. It's a mess, but it's also one of the most important institutions in this city and in this country. And you know, one of the things that just amazes me is the kind of energy and of the energy and kind of, you know, like hard work of a lot of the tenants, right? Like the repairs do not get done without tenant leaders fighting for them. You know, nothing really happens in a positive way unless it's tenants from below really pushing to make it happen. And so that does give me, you know, some level of kind of hope that there is a positive future possibly for Toronto community housing and for other, you know, large community housing initiatives in this country.
Arshy, the story that you told about the Toronto Housing Corporation was really you know, it was very impactful, and you know, the depth also of the kind of personal stories that you were able to tell was really amazing. People who haven't heard that should definitely check it out. One of the things though that I wanted to ask you, the NB Coalition for Tenants Rights has certainly been advocating for non-market housing. What lessons can we learn from you know, the successes, but also, of course, the failures of social housing thus far? What do we have to do to make sure that we get this right?
I think, you know, proper funding is just number one, right? Like you need money. This stuff is expensive. And governments do not want to pay, and that's just the reality. And so you need to constantly, I think, be pushing to make sure that there is enough money there to both build these buildings, to make sure that people have reasonable rents, and then to maintain them. But I think the second thing is to ensure that there is tenant involvement in the governance of these institutions, you know, both at the kind of like building or floor level, right? Like you want people to be able to kind of make decisions about, you know, what priorities are at a kind of like day-to-day thing, but then also in the larger governance of these. So for instance, the Toronto Community Housing Board does have a few tenant representatives, but the board itself is a kind of a mess, right? You know who governments like to put onto these boards, right? It's real estate developers, it's finance guys, it's people with MBAs, and honestly, they do not know what they're doing. Like they think they do because they got, you know, fancy degrees, or they ran a you know, their daddy's company or whatever. But many of them are incompetent when it comes to the issue of housing. So you need the right people in those positions, people who actually understand social housing, and also preferably people who have lived in it or are especially still living in it. You need people with stakes on the ground who understand why certain things will work and why others won't. At Toronto Community Housing, you know, you've had CEO after CEO leave in disgrace, usually around expense scandals, conflict of interest scandals, like a variety of different things. Oh, the Blaine Higgs of the exactly, yes, Blaine Higgs is an excellent example of this. But what you need is to make sure that you know, the leadership is held to account by the people that they're actually serving. So those are the two biggest things that I can see when we look at something like Toronto Community Housing and the lessons that we kind of need to learn from it. I guess maybe one other thing is, you know, build form does matter, I think, a lot. Like what the kind of housing is, like, you know, architecturally, both will determine whether there's buy-in from the rest of the kind of community, because guess what? The biggest opposition for social housing comes from the neighbors, right? Like, and, you know, bringing them into the process, I think, can be helpful, though there's some people you're never going to convince because, you know, they're racist or they're classist or what have you. But, you know, if you want a lot of social housing, you got to win those arguments. And so making things both like pretty, integrating them into the neighborhood, and ensuring that there is some kind of buy-in both will help the residents and also hopefully lead to an attitude of people wanting to get these projects off the ground and understanding that it is our kind of civic responsibility as a society to house people, right?
You also mentioned the Chrétien Martin cuts in 1995. Like one of the things that really affected a lot of people living in social housing was the income supports that were cut back at that time, or that have basically been limited since then. Can you just briefly, before I turn it back over to Aditya, can you talk a little bit about the importance also of ensuring that people who are in social housing are not in poverty?
I mean, this is one of the most important things, right? I mean, I was interested to see a report. I think I'm not totally sure where this is from, but it was out yesterday about why suicides dropped significantly during the pandemic. There was, I think everybody was kind of expecting an increase in suicidality as well as suicides, and we kind of got the opposite. And the conclusion that report came to was so much of it had to do with the income supports that were provided during the pandemic, right? People had just like enough money to get by at least for a little bit. There was financial help there. And so, when it comes to everything, people just, money is the biggest difference maker, right? It helps immensely. And so when we're talking about, say, social housing, a lot of the reasons people oppose social housing or may not want to live in it themselves is because of this idea that, a lot of the residents are going to be mentally ill. A lot of the residents maybe are involved in some form of criminality or things like that. And, I think having the proper supports in place will allow everybody to benefit and actually kind of increase the desirability of social housing. Because again, these are community institutions, people live in them together. And so what you need is to ensure that people can actually live lives of dignity. And I think, providing people with money and making sure that they're not impoverished will help with that. And just poverty is exacerbates all kinds of forms of mental illness, and then that can create dangers for other residents too, right? Hoarding is a common problem in social housing and frankly, all kinds of housing, right? But it can become especially dangerous in some of these larger social housing places because it creates a risk of fire. And, hoarding can be exacerbated by poverty. It can certainly be exacerbated by not having access to community or to proper mental health services. And so by actually tackling that, we're not just helping the individual, we're helping everybody. So yeah, I think it's essential to make sure people aren't living in horrific poverty, right? I think we're all on the same page on that one, though I guess not everybody in society is.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Arshy. Thanks for your work. Thanks for your discussion here. Adi, I'm going to turn it back to you for some Q&A from the audience.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Thanks, Arshy. So to moderate the Q&A, I'm going to invite Tobin Haley to join us. Tobin is a critical disabilities scholar and a political science professor, as well as a community activist and a founder of the New Brunswick Coalition for Tenants Rights. Tobin is also the host of the New Brunswick Debrief, a political talk show that the NB Media Co-op and Charlotte County Television have launched together. You can learn more about the NB Debrief at nbdebrief.org. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Tobin. And there's already a couple of questions that have come to me, so I'm going to send it right to you, Tobin, via private message.
Wonderful. Thanks, Aditya. And hi, everybody. Nice to see all of you. And I'm excited about this conversation. So I guess I will turn first to the questions in the chat. But if anyone wants to ask a question, if you want to voice your own question, you're welcome to raise your hand. And I can call on you, but I will start with the questions in the chat. Okay. Okay. So can you talk about what you discovered in terms of the displacement of Black Canadians, particularly in regard to Africville in Nova Scotia, and what that tells us about how real estate wealth accumulation really works in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, Africville is just, one of the most kind of horrible stories. in kind of recent Canadian history, this was a place where a lot of people have been living for 150 years. A lot of Black residents and families had been there for a very long time, but they did not necessarily have kind of title to their property in that way. But of course, that was the case in communities all over. Even with kind of white communities, right? Like not everybody necessarily kind of had a piece of paper with their thing on it, with their name on it, but it was a community that certainly had claim to that land. And as time kind of passed, and as the community of Halifax grew around, and Africville as well, I think there's no way of saying it other than the racist perceptions of the majority in Nova Scotia, and especially of the political class, began to have very dramatic consequences for people in Africville. One important kind of point or turning point was the Halifax explosion, which decimated much of the north end of Halifax. Africville was largely spared from that, but that's when you see an even kind of more dramatic disparity, but in the level of services that the Black residents in Africville and the largely white residents in the rest of the north end of Halifax were able to get. So there were no roads in Africville, there was no sewage, there was no anything. And every time they wanted to build something that was displeasing to people, whether it was an infectious diseases hospital or a jail, or most infamously the town dump, they put it in Africville. And so by the time you get to the 1950s and 1960s, in which you have a sort of more self-avowedly progressive political class in place in Halifax, they look over at Africville and they say, well, look at that horrible slum. We need to go save these Black, Haligonians, right? Like, we need to do something for them. And of course, the solution that they came up with was not to provide the same level of services that Black residents in Africville had been denied for so long. It was, well, let's just clear them out. And that's the thing that always captures me most, is that this was seen as a progressive initiative, right? This was done by the do-gooders in a way. The racists were cheering too, right? The self-avowed racists, but this was seen largely as a positive step. But of course, just like in so many of these stories, the people of Africville were barely compensated for the destruction of their homes. They were mostly lied to as well. Many of them were told that they would be given property that they could purchase, or that they would own in another part of the city, because ownership was incredibly important to the residents of Africville. And they weren't. They were basically put into social housing, which for many people was seen as humiliating. And many of them then, a lot of the kind of work in Africville revolved around Africville itself. They were denied that. And so many had to go on the welfare rolls as well. And so you see not only this kind of, again, this theft, this destruction, but you also see just a general, attempted diminishing the proud nature of of Africville residents. And, at my more cynical moments, I think that's exactly what the purpose was, right? That was what people couldn't stand at the end of the day, was just seeing a Black community that was self-sufficient in its own way. Even today, Africville, there's now a small memorial there. They rebuilt the church. It's a kind of park, but the land still hasn't been given back. They could easily do that. Eddie Carvery, who's the main person I talked to for that piece, he's been living basically in Africville on and off for the last 50 years to protest this, whether just sleeping outside or in a tent or in a trailer, whatever it may be. He's been, putting his own body kind of on the line to be a reminder of that. And what he argues is that, look, just build something here and let Africville exist once again. You can do that. And I think he's right. it's a park now, but it doesn't have to be. You can build houses there, and you can allow, the former residents or descendants of those residents the opportunity to move back. I don't see why that would be so difficult.
Thank you so much. That's such a lovely and comprehensive answer, and reminds us of the destruction of the church. I mean, the destruction of all of Africville, but in particular that moment when the church was brought down with an execution.
Which they did in the middle of the night, of course, because they knew they were doing something wrong here. They were a little ashamed.
Attacking what was, often referred to as the heart of that community, sort of that physical representation. So yeah, thank you for that. Another question here. Your work has also involved looking at family dynasties, including the Irvings. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and how you see that at all as being sort of related to the conversation on housing? So I didn't read that very well, but basically the question is, thinking about family dynasties, including the Irvings, can you tell us a little bit about how you see that connected to the conversation on housing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, the Irvings are maybe the most fascinating, strange family in Canada. I'm always interested in the very rich and wealthy and powerful as subjects of journalism, which I think is a little bit out of style these days. But I don't know, I think we need to understand the feudal lords who deign to rule us, right? And there's nobody who there's no family that treats itself more like a royal dynasty in this country than the Irvings, right? Totally willful in how they get away with everything, whether it's environmental destruction, not paying taxes, basically controlling the government. I mean, literally, the Irving VP is the premier of British Columbia right now, right? It's kind of amazing. I'm not totally sure if I see where, I guess the Irvings would probably be one of the biggest landlords in Canada, but I'm not sure, do they own a lot of housing in New Brunswick? I'm curious. I don't think that's really one of their kinds of businesses. So I guess I kind of see where the connections that I see are just around. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is one, you basically need kind of well-off parents to buy a place now. So everybody's kind of living in a little dynastic universe, right? I think we can see that with friends and colleagues who aren't lucky enough to be able to get that parental support, and I do not begrudge them a second, because if I have that, I would take it too. But that's a weird little dynastic kind of tangent. But I don't know, when it comes to the Irvings, they're just what I just see is just absolute and utter power. They can do whatever they want at any point. They have total impunity, and because of especially the control they have over New Brunswick in particular, that doesn't seem it's going to change. But yeah, I don't think I have too much on the kind of connection there, unfortunately, but I do find them fascinating.
We here in New Brunswick, we always a dig at sort of that oligarchical dynastic wealth. So
yeah, I mean, I just remember going to St. John, visiting New Brunswick for the first time, going from the airport into downtown, and just seeing on the side, by the refinery, the big IRVING, and it's oh yeah, I know who owns the city. Okay, that's cool.
Okay, so we could talk all night about the Irvings. What are your predictions for housing rights in Canada, and are you hopeful?
I mean, I'm a little bit hopeful that at least the kind of horrific rent increases I think we've seen, especially in New Brunswick, might lead eventually to some kind of rent control. It's shocking to me what landlords can really get away with in New Brunswick in particular. So I don't think it's going to happen under a PC government, but I can imagine that this is just going to become more and more of an issue, and some political change, I think, is inevitable. So that's one thing that I think is a little bit hopeful. In terms of everything else, I mean, look, I'm incredibly pessimistic about the future of housing, tell you the truth. The primary reason being, I think we live in, one of the main factors around driving up kind of housing costs in a wide variety of situations are interest rates, right? Like that, I mean, that drives so much of this. So if we're talking about, say, the financialization of kind of housing, when you have these REITs and you have these asset managers buying up big apartment blocks and things like that, so much of what they're after is they're chasing yield, right? Interest rates have been so low for so long in so much of the Western world that anything that can provide any kind of a return becomes super valuable. And every little bit that you can squeeze out of it becomes incredibly valuable. And you have access to all of this capital in order to make these kinds of large purchases. And I just don't think, and obviously when it comes to the purchasing end, say if you want to buy a home for yourself or a condo or an apartment, a lot of that demand is also driven by very low interest rates. And I just don't think we're ever going to be in an environment again in which we have high interest rates that might rebalance this. And so, when it comes to just like the do nothing solution and the supply and demand will kind of solve itself, well, that's clearly not going to happen. When it comes to social housing, I'm a little bit more optimistic. I can, some social housing is, say, being built in British Columbia. Like there's much more of it than there used to be. It's still not nearly enough, but there, at least I've seen in places that the attitudes can change and people can really see it as more of an important issue. What happened there? And then when it comes to I think the other thing we do need at some point, even though I kind of hate it, is probably just, more construction at kind of every level. The developers are evil. And if it were up to me, I would not rely on them. I would love the government to get much more directly involved in the business of housing. But I understand how this country works and the kind of political realities. And so I imagine it's going to be a lot of evil developers. We're going to need them to build a lot of stuff because at the end of the day, we have way fewer units of housing than most other, kind of like G7 countries. We don't have a lot of apartment blocks. A lot of our larger and even mid-sized cities are very kind of suburban feeling. And they have, the housing is mostly just like single family homes and living in, and you don't really have like different kinds of housing stock. You can, I think, especially see that in places like Victoria and Prince Edward Island right now, where it is literally impossible to find a rental. Like, it's not just the price, it is, there is no space. So students at UVic or at UPEI right now, a lot of them are having, they can't find a place to live anywhere. I had a friend who just tried to move to Victoria. He was there for 3 months. He has a fairly good income, and he couldn't literally find anything, which is just kind of absurd. So maybe we'll start building more. That would be good, but I would like, if it were up to me, it would be much more the government actually getting involved and doing it. So am I optimistic? Like, no, I just don't. I think at the end of the day, there's too many people invested in both having high house prices and high rents, and they're very politically powerful. And to have those go down would be kind of a disaster for them. And so they're just going to maintain the status quo. But hopefully on social housing, at least, I'm a little bit hopeful there. And again, on rental protections in New Brunswick, because it's, it should be pretty easy to move up from like nothing, right? Like if your bar is so low, then...
It is on the floor, yes. But yeah, more government investment in all kinds of housing, more public investment, right, in lots of different kinds of housing is what I'm hearing, but not a ton of optimism that that's necessarily going to happen.
No, but I'm famously a pessimist too when it comes to basically everything. So I don't know. You probably shouldn't trust me for predictions. I'm better at looking backwards and forwards.
All right, so we've got one last question for you. This comes from Christine Lane. Thank you, Arshy. I really appreciate the work you've done on real estate, racism, classism, and colonialism in Canada. I was concerned when I saw several political parties produce platforms that seem to blame racialized communities and national others, particularly Chinese Canadians, for Canada's housing problems. How do we address issues like money laundering through Canadian real estate without contributing to racism?
I mean, this is one of the toughest issues out there right now. And I've seen with the conversation around money laundering and high house prices, like the toll it's taken on Vancouver's, especially Chinese community. The number of kind of racial incidents and attacks are up significantly. I hear all kinds of casual racism when I'm back in town, blaming basically every Chinese person for, the inability to get a house. But at the same time, we do know that money coming in from different parts of the world is having a big influence on housing markets. So yeah, it is a hard thread to kind of walk. You don't walk a thread, tightrope. I don't know. I think the solution is specificity, right? It is to, as activists, as journalists, as commentators, we need to make sure that we're not actually contributing significantly to that by ensuring that that the people being blamed are not the broad swath of Chinese Canadians or Canadians of Chinese descent. Because one, it's about wealthy people, right? Like, I mean, that's who is to blame. So I think taking some of the focus off of the race of the people who might have the money that are driving that and putting it onto their class, which is like extremely wealthy, like oligarchs who are both from, many of whom are from British Columbia and are white, and many of them are from other parts of the world. That is essential because, in BC, the conversation so much is specifically around Chinese Canadians. If you look at Toronto, yes, there is a Chinese element to the money laundering that goes on here, but it's everywhere. It's Russian and Ukrainian, it's Iranian, it's American, right? Like a lot of it is coming from all over, and that's probably more representative of what money laundering looks like throughout Canada. I mean, BC and Vancouver is a particular case because of our close connections to Hong Kong and to mainland China. But even there, a lot of the money laundering isn't necessarily just done by people with connections to those places. So I don't know. I think it's about constantly like pushing back against racist assumptions. It's about putting the blame where it actually belongs, which is both on the wealthy people, but then also on the politicians and the various classes of people who benefit from a lot of this dirty money. And again, demonstrating as like making that further link that we often fail to, which is like, well, who's being robbed of this money? It's Chinese people in China, at least when we're talking about the cases of kind of like criminals and whatnot coming over from China to Canada, right? Like it's the Chinese state, it's everyday Chinese folks who are being deprived of it, right? It's their race doesn't matter. It's just like there's a bunch of rich criminal assholes out there from all over. But I always try to be careful when I am reporting on this to do that, but at the same time, sometimes I worry that whether or not my reporting or the kind of work that I do might be contributing to that, and I don't know necessarily, but I sure hope it doesn't, and I hope that by being kind of specific and clear, you can try to at least mitigate that. But yeah, I mean, the way in which political parties kind of use this to bash each other over the heads, especially the Conservatives in the last election, is disgusting. And I think that is really where we see a lot of this kind of coming out of. And it's only going to get worse because now this kind of Cold War attitude towards China continues to increase. And I think racism against Chinese people in this country is probably going to get worse for a variety of reasons.
Thanks so much. I think we're out of time for questions, so we're going to end on the note about focusing on the global circulation of capital and not falling into racist tropes about that kind of wealth accumulation. So I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and sort of very deep thinking about these issues tonight. I'm going to hand it back over to Aditya.
Thanks so much, Tobin. Arshy, thank you so much for being with us today. We're at the end of time that we had allocated for our event tonight. We could not be more grateful that you joined us and shared your thoughts and drew on some of the incredible work that you've been doing. So in closing, I just want to thank everybody for coming today. A special thank you to Tracy Glynn for organizing everything, making sure everything was in order for today and the AGM, as well as tonight's talk by Arshy. Shout out to both the NB Media Co-op for their AGM today and the New Brunswick Coalition for Tenants Rights for co-hosting this event. Please visit the NB Media Co-op at nbmediacoop.org, and please consider becoming a monthly donor to support our work. Please check out Canadaland Commons on your favorite podcast app and follow the important work that Arshy and his colleagues are doing. And congratulations to the staff at Canadaland for having recently unionized. So with that.
And yeah, not to reveal too much, but I think we're pretty close to an actual agreement there. And I'll also let you in, our next season's going to be about mining, and that's going to start up in about 3 weeks. So please give that a listen to. And yeah, just thank you all so much for having me. It was great.
Amazing. Thank you. Arshy, if you want to stick around for a couple seconds as folks leave, and then we can have a quick side chat after. So thank you, everybody, for joining.